People believe the story of the Titanic is finished. A ship hits an iceberg, sinks into the Atlantic, and becomes a tragic symbol of human arrogance. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the Titanic never actually sank the way we were told? What if the disaster that defined an entire century was only the beginning of something much larger, something hidden in silence in time? On that cold night, the ocean was calm. The stars reflected on the water like a mirror. Passengers laughed, talked, dreamed about new lives waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. The Titanic moved forward, confident and unstoppable. But when the iceberg appeared, history reached a crossroads. A single decision, a single moment, and everything could have gone differently. Imagine the impact was not fatal. Imagine the hull held together just long enough. The engine slowed. The crew reacted faster. The ship stayed afloat, wounded but alive, instead of sinking into darkness. The Titanic survived the night, drifting until rescue arrived. By morning, the world woke up to a miracle instead of tragedy. The headlines would have been different. The Titanic would not be remembered as a grave beneath the ocean, but as proof that human engineering could defy nature itself. Confidence would turn into obsession. Shipbuilders would push limits even further. Bigger vessels, faster routes, fewer safety concerns. After all, if the Titanic survived, what could possibly go wrong? The survivors would return home as witnesses to history. They would tell stories not of loss, but of triumph. The myth of invincibility would spread across nations. Governments would invest more in expansion than caution. The ocean would no longer be feared. It would be challenged. But survival has consequences. Without the shock of disaster, safety regulations would remain weak. Lifeboats would be seen as unnecessary. Warnings would be ignored. And the next ship might not be so lucky. History would move forward with blind confidence, unaware that the lesson it needed most was never learned. The Titanic itself will become a symbol of power, a floating monument. It would sail again, carrying politicians, industrial leaders, and the elite. Every journey reinforcing the belief that humanity had conquered the natural world. And with that belief, humility would quietly disappear. Decades later, the world might look very different. Trade routes expanded faster. Globalization accelerated earlier. Empires strengthened their reach across oceans. Wars moved supplies quicker. The sea became a highway instead of a barrier, all because one ship refused to sink. But deep beneath the waves, the ocean would wait, silent, patient, because nature does not forget arrogance. It only delays a reminder. And somewhere in that altered timeline, a greater disaster would be forming, larger, deadlier, more unforgiving than anything before. So the question remains, was the sinking of the Titanic a tragedy? Or was it a warning that saved countless lives in the future? And if it had never sunk, would our world be safer or far more dangerous than we could ever imagine? Because sometimes the disasters that hurt us the most are the ones that teach us how to survive. And sometimes the miracles we celebrate are the ones that lead us quietly towards something much worse. In this altered world, the absence of a great maritime tragedy would slowly reshape the collective memory of humanity. Without a symbol of loss powerful enough to humble progress, society would grow louder, faster, and more certain of its own superiority. Innovation would no longer ask permission. It would demand applause. Engineers would celebrate efficiency over safety, speed over caution, ambition over restraint. The ocean, once respected as an unpredictable force, would become merely another obstacle to dominate. Children would grow up hearing stories of the great ship that survived the impossible. The Titanic would be taught as proof that intelligence always triumphs. Schools would praise the triumph of steel and calculation. Museums would display fragments of ice and bent metal, not as warnings, but as trophies. Humanity would no longer remember fear. It would remember victory. As years passed, shipping lanes would multiply. Cities would grow dependent on massive vessels carrying food, fuel, weapons, and people across vast distances. Nations would build their power on the assumption that the seas were mastered forever. Any voice calling for caution would be dismissed as outdated, pessimistic, or weak. Confidence would drown out concern. Meanwhile, the people who had been on board that night would carry a quieter burden. They would remember the sound of ice scraping steel, the sudden silence, the brief moment when the ship hesitated between survival and death. Some would wake in the night, haunted not by what happened, but by what almost did. They would understand something the world refused to see. That survival does not mean invulnerability, but time erodes memory. As generations change, even those voices will fade. The Titanic would become legend rather than experience, a story polished by distance. And legends rarely teach humility. They teach pride. With trade accelerating, borders would blur sooner. Economies would intertwine faster than trust could keep up. Competition for dominance would intensify beneath the surface of cooperation. Nations would rely on the sea not only for commerce, but for control. Fleets would grow larger, routes more crowded, and the margin for error thinner with every passing year. Then, one night, somewhere far from land, another ship would face a moment like the Titanic once did. Another unexpected collision, another miscalculation, another belief that technology would save them. But this time, there would be no miracle, no slow drift into rescue. Only darkness, panic, and silence swallowing steel and lives alike. The shock would be far greater than any tragedy before, because the world would be unprepared. There would be no regulation strong enough to soften the blow, no safety culture shaped by past loss. The disaster would not feel like an accident. It would feel like betrayal, a sudden reminder that the ocean had never been conquered at all. Markets would collapse in fear. Trust in global systems would fracture overnight. Governments would scramble to explain what could not be undone. And for the first time, humanity would realize that the warning it needed had been missed decades earlier, disguised as a miracle. Historians in this world will look back and ask a dangerous question. What if the Titanic had sunk? What if that early pain had forced humility into progress? What if loss had shaped responsibility instead of pride shaping recklessness? They would wonder whether one tragedy could have prevented a far greater one. In this reality, monuments would be built not to the Titanic, but to the unnamed disaster that finally broke the illusion. Memorials would speak of lessons learned too late, of arrogance unchecked, of a world that mistook survival for permission. And yet, even then, the cycle would not truly end, because humanity has always struggled to learn from near misses. We grow cautious only after falling. We listen only after loss. And sometimes, even the greatest disasters are not enough to change who we are. So the Titanic, in this imagined timeline, would remain floating in history not as a grave, but as a shadow, a silent reminder of the path not taken, a symbol not a tragedy, but of a warning that never arrived when it was needed most. Perhaps that is why, in our world, the ship had to sink, not because humanity failed, but because humanity needed to be humbled, because some lessons cannot be taught through survival. They must be carved into memory through loss. And maybe the cold Atlantic did not claim the Titanic out of cruelty, but out of necessity. A harsh correction, a line drawn between progress and pride, a reminder that nature does not negotiate with confidence. Because the Titanic had never sunk, the world might have sailed faster, grown richer, expanded further, but it might also have forgotten something essential, that power without humility always ends the same way, beneath the surface, in silence, and somewhere in every great achievement, there must be a reminder of fragility. Without it, history does not move forward. It only repeats itself in darker, deeper waters. In this world shaped by unchecked confidence, the oceans would slowly transform into symbols of dominance rather than mystery. Ships would grow larger than cities, carrying entire economies within their steel walls. People would speak of the sea with casual certainty, as if it were a road paved by human hands. The idea of danger would feel distant, almost fictional. Survival would be assumed, never questioned. Cultural narratives would reflect this mindset. Films, books, and speeches would celebrate mastery and control. Heroes would not be those who respected limits, but those who ignored them. Progress would be measured by speed and scale alone. The quieter virtues of patience and caution would fade into the background, replaced by relentless forward motion. The Titanic, still remembered as a ship that refused to sink, would quietly shape these beliefs. Its survival will be used to justify every risk that followed. Whenever doubt emerged, its name would be spoken as reassurance. It survived once. It will always survive. And so will we. But beneath the surface, subtle changes would begin to appear. Weather patterns would grow less predictable. Oceans would grow more crowded. Technology would become more complex, but also more fragile. Systems would depend on each other so tightly that a single failure could trigger a chain reaction beyond control. Yet few would notice. Fewer would care. Those who studied history deeply would feel uneasy. They would see patterns forming, familiar shapes repeating themselves across time. They would recognize that civilizations often collapse not because they lack intelligence, but because they trusted too much. Their warnings, however, would sound old and unnecessary in a world obsessed with forward momentum. As global connections intensified, conflicts would become more subtle but more dangerous. Control of trade routes would mean control of nations. Power would no longer be measured by armies alone, but by access to the seas. Political tensions would travel silently aboard cargo ships and passenger liners, hidden behind commerce and cooperation. Then, slowly, stories would begin to circulate. Small incidents at first. Near misses, equipment failures, crews disappearing without explanation. These events would be dismissed as coincidences, anomalies, bad luck. The larger narrative of dominance would remain untouched. No one wanted to question the foundation of modern confidence, until the night when everything changed again. This time, the disaster would not involve a single ship. It would involve many. A cascading failure across routes, systems, and nations. One breakdown triggering another, until the illusion of control shattered all at once. The sea would reclaim its voice in a language of storms, silence, and loss. Panic would spread faster than the waves themselves. News would travel instantly across the world, but understanding would lag behind. People would search for someone to blame, something to fix, a lever to pull. But there would be no simple explanation, only the realization that the world had built itself on assumptions that were never truly tested. In the aftermath, society would struggle to rebuild not just infrastructure, but trust. Faith in technology would fracture. Faith in leadership would erode. People would ask questions they had avoided for generations. Were we ever in control? Or were we simply lucky for longer than we realized? Survivors would tell stories not unlike those whispered by Titanic passengers long ago. Stories of moments when everything felt balanced on a knife's edge. Of seconds where survival and disaster felt indistinguishable. Of how thin the line truly is between progress and collapse. Historians would rewrite timelines, tracing the roots of catastrophe back to the moment humanity mistook survival for superiority. They would circle the Titanic again, not as a hero, but as a turning point misunderstood, a lesson disguised as victory, a warning silenced by celebration. In private conversations, some would dare to say what once felt unthinkable, that perhaps the world needed loss to learn restraint, that perhaps pain had a purpose, not as punishment, but as instruction. These ideas would feel uncomfortable, even cruel, but they would linger because they explained too much to ignore. As generations passed, this altered world would slowly begin to resemble our own. Regulations would emerge, written in the ink of regret. Memorials would be built, not to glorify conquest, but to remember fragility. Education would shift from celebrating dominance to understanding balance. But the cost would be immense. And still, the question would remain unresolved. Could all of this have been avoided? Could one early tragedy have spared countless later ones? Or would humanity have found another way to test its limits regardless? Perhaps the truth is darker. Perhaps humanity needs repeated reminders. Perhaps we are wired to forget vulnerability as soon as comfort returns. Perhaps no single disaster, no matter how great, can permanently change the course of our ambition. In that sense, the Titanic's survival would not have saved the world or doomed it outright. It would have simply delayed the inevitable confrontation between confidence and consequence. A confrontation that always arrives, sooner or later, in one form or another, because history is not shaped only by what happens, but by how we interpret it. And when interpretation favors pride over humility, the future quietly sharpens its edges. So in this imagined timeline, the Titanic continues to sail through memory not as wreckage beneath the sea, but as a ghost above it, a presence felt rather than seen, a reminder of how close humanity came to learning a lesson early, and how far it went instead. And maybe that is the most unsettling thought of all, that sometimes the difference between wisdom and disaster is not intelligence or effort, but timing, and that the moments that spare you us pain may also rob us of understanding. The ocean, vast and patient, would remain unchanged by all of this. It would continue to move as it always has, indifferent to human stories and ambitions, waiting, watching, knowing that no matter how advanced the vessels become, they are still guests upon its surface. In the end, whether the Titanic sank or survived, the deeper truth would remain the same. Humanity does not conquer nature. It negotiates with it, often poorly and always temporarily. And the question that echoes through this alternate history is not what if the Titanic never sank. It is whether humanity would ever truly listen, no matter what the ocean tried to teach.